Hello, AP Psych students. We're going to go through the Unit 6 review. I know we started it in class. A lot of us didn't finish, so I want to make sure that you are well prepared for tomorrow's test coming up. I'm not sure if you can see there. I guess you can see the top. There will be 25 multiple choice, one FRQ worth 6 points. There will be an old an old previous chapter's bullet point added in there. So be aware of that. So that would be 62 point tests coming up tomorrow. So let's get into this. Learning as a change in behavior as the result of experience. Keyword there being the change. We're talking about the change in behavior as the result of experience, meaning if you don't change your behavior, then you can't really count it as learning. And we can see this this experience coming through either classical or operant conditioning. Let's talk first about classical. Is when we control the behavior through an automatic response. Like it's an automatic thing. You don't really get to control whether or not it's elicited. And operant conditioning is when somebody might manipulate the stimuli in order to change behavior. Now, don't think that this is only in humans. Animals can also very much respond to operant conditioning. If any of you have a dog and they get something, either punishment or reward for a behavior, that is operant conditioning. Spontaneous recovery then. Now these can be either classical or operant, and so this is a case where you just have to kind of read the question carefully. What I will say as we get on to some of these other ones, don't exactly think that I am, like let's say I give you a question on the conditioned response, or maybe I give you a couple questions on maybe the conditioned stimulus or the conditioned response, but none on the neutral stimulus. Don't exactly think that, oh, well, I just answered a question and the answer was conditioned response, and so it can't be another conditioned response. Don't exactly think that. I'm not saying that you're going to have every question on every single one of these ideas, but collectively, maybe on the multiple choice, you would see all four of these, but only one of them would be correct. But I need you to know spontaneous recovery. The sudden appearance after a rest period of the exposure to an extinguished stimuli, the exposure to the conditioned response. So it comes back when you'd pair it again. So if it worked for you for classical conditioning, that Pavlov's training worked, and I said Pavlov and your mouth watered, and after a while that quit. And if I went back to it and I gave you Fun Dip again and I started that whole story of Pavlov and it came back, that is spontaneous recovery. Extinction is a diminished conditioned response, usually because the unconditioned stimulus doesn't follow the conditioned stimulus, meaning it's going to go away. It's a diminished conditioned response. Something wasn't paired anymore, and so that association kind of lost its luster, if you will. Generalization says a similar stimuli elicits a similar response. And discrimination is when there's a distinguished response between two stimuli. You can tell the difference, and so in this case you would have a behavior, but in this case you wouldn't. Thorndike's law of effect says that the desired behavior will likely occur after learning the reward. So you find out that the reward is pretty good, you will continue that behavior. If that reward isn't enough to entice you, you tend not to do that behavior. Pavlov's training. Okay, please know Pavlov's training. This is classical conditioning at its finest, and you should always associate Pavlov and classical conditioning. You see the little chart there, the diagram on the left. Make sure you know that. Make sure you know what each part not only means to Pavlov's conditioning or Pavlov's training, but in general, the unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus that automatically triggers a response. The unconditioned response is that reflexive response. In the case of Pavlov, it's the drool, it's the salivation that his dogs have. You give dogs food and they drool just because that's what dogs do. Those two are reflexive responsive. There's no conditioning that's happened at that point. You see on the far left. But what Pavlov realized is that if he paired the unconditioned stimulus with something else, he would get a conditioned stimulus. A stimulus is paired with a neutral stimulus, and the association is made. So in this case, it's ring the bell, get the food, ring the bell, get the food, ring the bell, get the food. Eventually, you don't even need to give them the food. You only have to ring the bell, and you will get the conditioned response. It's the reflexive response, which seems the same as the unconditioned response, but in this case, it's after the conditioning. And then the neutral stimulus. The neutral stimulus means nothing until it is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, and that pairing, that association means a lot. And then in this case, it was the bell. And then a conditioned stimulus elicits a conditioned response. Watson, he's the one who famously, remember baby Albert, right? He's the one who famously said that only observable behavior is useful to measure. Like what they're thinking, what they're feeling is of no use to them. Only observable behavior. Remember, he's the one who said, give me 12 healthy infants, well-formed, and I will make them into whatever I want. Skinner, he was the operant conditioner. You should always associate Skinner and operant conditioning. He says that learned consequence of behavior stem from the environment. So you will learn of the consequences of your behavior from really the nurture, right? This is not nature. This is strictly nurture from your environment. You will learn what is appropriate behavior, what's not appropriate behavior. So Skinner started understanding how reinforcement works. Reinforcement is encouraging or increasing behavior. It's what we want to happen. Reinforcement encourages behavior, the behavior we want to elicit. So positive reinforcement is adding something pleasant to increase behavior. Let me say that again, adding something pleasant to increase behavior. If we want that behavior to occur, we add something that you enjoy in order to get it to occur again in the future. That's Thorndike's law of effect, right? We give you something good and you'll keep doing it. Negative reinforcement is the removal of an unpleasant, something that is not enjoyable. The removal of an unpleasantness, so behavior that caused it to stop is reinforced. So we want a behavior to happen, so we remove something unpleasant so that behavior ends and a different behavior will happen. A really good example of this is your alarm clock. The buzzing is unpleasant. The beeping is unpleasant. You hit the stop button on your alarm to stop the unpleasantness in order to get you to wake up, which is what the alarm needs you to do. But you do it. That is completely operant conditioning. You are changing your behavior. So there are two types of reinforcers. Primary is like food, water, shelter. Those reinforcers are what we always tend to work for, but we don't think of it. Typically, the reinforcers that are most successful are the conditioned reinforcers. Sometimes we call them secondary reinforcers. Things like money, praise, grades, extra opportunities. That's when you change your behavior really in order to achieve the primary reinforcers, but you don't think about it. Like you don't think about stopping at a stop sign. That's not a very good example. Let's give you money. You don't think about getting your paycheck so you can, sleep in a bed, but you do think about getting your paycheck so you can buy the things that you like. That's a strong secondary reinforcer. Reinforcement schedules, there's a few of these. I think actually I might have one of each of these, so do be very aware of how they're different. So a fixed interval is a certain amount or passage of time until reinforcement is given. Now I want you to remember we're talking interval, we're talking a passage of time. We're not talking a number, but we're talking about a certain quantity of time, a certain passage of time until the reinforcement is given. So you're going to get the reinforcement. You're going to get that something pleasant, but you have to wait a certain amount of time. For instance, a paycheck after 2 weeks. Fixed ratio is a set number of behaviors or responses in order to get the reinforcement. So let's say if you, a certain number of behaviors, if you buy 4 pizzas, you get the 5th one free. You have a certain number of behaviors and then you get the free pizza, the 5th one. Fixed ratio. Variable ratio is when the reinforcement is given after an unpredictable amount of time. Like, you're going to get it, you just don't know when, and so you have to wait for it. You're not sure. Variable interval is probably, for me, the cell phone parking. I don't think that would be a variable ratio because we're not talking about necessarily the amount of behaviors. I'm looking for more of an amount of time. I'm not going to give it every day, every so often. Variable ratio is when a reinforcement is given after a unpredictable number of behaviors. So cell phone parking. That could be a good one. But you're going to do something. You're going to have a unpredictable number of behaviors. Like, you'll do something and then you will get the reward. So let's say playing bingo, maybe. You'll do it, and then that sheet that we had gone through on schedules of reinforcement, variable ratio, playing bingo. That's a good one. Please note what that thing in the margin says there, the little brackets there. The variable schedules have the greatest resistance to extinction and encourage behavior. They have the greatest resistance to extinction and encourage behavior because they're unpredictable. You don't know when they're going to happen. They're random, they're occasionally. And so human behavior and animal behavior says that we will work harder or more efficiently to get it after a certain number of behaviors or a certain amount of time. Punishment. Punishment discourages behavior. We don't want that to happen, and so we either add something or subtract something. Positive punishment, which sounds very odd, but positive punishment is when we add something unpleasant to stop or discourage behavior. Spanking is a very good example of positive punishment. Adding something unpleasant in order to stop that behavior. Negative is taking something away that you enjoy, taking something that you desire away in order to discourage that behavior. Taking away your driving privileges because you sped is a good example. Losing your license because you were speeding is a good example of negative punishment. We'd assume that you want to have the privilege to drive, but you were speeding, therefore you lose your license because you were speeding. We don't want that behavior to happen. Effective punishment. Now, we talked a lot in the fishbowl about this. Effective punishment should be swift, meaning you shouldn't linger on it. It should happen right then and there. It should be limited in its intensity. If a person doesn't respond to the punishment, upping the punishment, increasing the intensity of the punishment, yelling louder is not always effective. And it should be for the behavior and not the character. And somebody mentioned I remember 4th period, and it was such a really kind of fantastic comment that they made. You are inherently good. Your behavior is what was bad. It was not you, it was your behavior. You made a bad choice, but it's not your character, it's not your soul, it's your behavior. And so the goal is to change that behavior. Some of the downsides of punishment is that it suppresses other behaviors, you kind of almost become fearful of doing things. It increases or may increase aggressive behaviors, and not only toward the thing, like if your parent was giving the punishment, it might not be aggressive behavior toward the parent, it might be in other ways. It manifests, it shows itself in other ways. It teaches fear and discrimination. And so punishment, if it's going to be used, should be swift, limited in intensity, and very brief for the behavior, not the person. Because if it's not, then we can see a lot of negative parts of punishment showing the ugly side of it. Token economy reinforcers that encourage good behavior in exchange for a reward. So this is an example of reinforcement that you have to collect so many and then you get it. We talked a lot about orthobucks. That's token economy. Shaping by successive approximation is when behavior is guided little by little to the desired outcome. Shaping by successive approximation is really great in children where where you need them to learn something, where you're trying to teach them something, but it would be too much for you to just expect them to know it all at once. So for instance, the best example of shaping by successive approximation is learning to read or learning to write your name. Before I can teach you to learn how to write your name, you got to learn how to hold a pencil. And then you have to learn how to make the shape of a letter. And you probably even need to know how to make the sound of the letter. And eventually we can get you to write your name. But if I give a 4-year-old a pencil and be like, write your name, they don't have a clue. And so you need to do little by little, step by step to get you to the goal. Latent learning is learning that is not immediately expressed. This is Tolman saying you have it, but you don't need to show it right away. In this classroom, we learn when we are not even aware of it, is what the poster says. So learning that's not immediately expressed, mostly because you don't need to show that you know it right then and there. We see latent learning through a cognitive map, a mental representation of one's environment or location as a result of previous learning. This is when you go and tour college, and if any of you go on college tours and you're like, oh, I really, really like UND, and then you take a tour of the campus and you decide to go to UND, and then you just kind of remember, oh, if I were here, then I would walk here to get to the student union, and I'd walk here to get to my history class, or whatever it happens to be, because you wouldn't even have to take psych because you're going to pass this test no problem. Insight learning is a sudden understanding of a problem. It's not trial and error. It's not like, oh, I'm going to try this, and if it doesn't work, I'll try something else. It just all of the sudden comes to you. And modeling. I want you to really understand modeling behavior. Observable behavior is learned from others. Albert Bandura showed probably one of the most famous experiments that you learn your behavior. This is nurture at its finest. Observable behavior is learned from others. How many of you saw your maybe brothers or sisters get punished and we were like, I ain't ever doing that because mom will kill me? If you learned from others' behavior, that is what Albert Bandura would call modeling. We know that adults have very, very strong modeling behaviors toward children, meaning children will imitate what adults do. That's what he did with the Bobo doll. Experiments with children observing violence led to the children acting violent, being more aggressive and showing violent behaviors, and actually oftentimes even more violent than the parent showed. And so if you think about the ramifications of that for children growing up in abusive homes, the cycle of abuse is very strong because it's the behavior that they saw, and oftentimes it is actually increased, and the cycle of abuse continues to go on. So that's it. If you have any questions, of course, send me a Teams chat or an email, and I'll see you tomorrow. Good luck.